Okay, after another hiatus, we are back. Audiobooks All Day is back. Jeff here and Kevin are here to break down books. The whole reason why we started this channel was so that we could get together and talk about books that we're listening to. And we're back and excited about it. And today we are covering Planet of the Apes. Kevin, kick us off.
Yeah, so Planet of the Apes is a book written by Pierre Boulle. I think I pronounced that correct, but Boulle. It was published in 1963. I learned something researching the book is that there are actually 7 books in the series, but only one of them was written by Pierre. So were they really part of a series? But the basic premise of this book is the main character Ulysses joins with his friend Professor Antel to travel to the distant star of Betelgeuse in a planet nearby. Professor Antel is essentially given up on the human race. He's getting old and he wants an adventure. So they go to this star that's many, many light years away. And because he developed an engine where they can essentially reach light speed, it only takes them a couple years. And they get there just to find out that the planet is inhabited not by humans, but by sapient monkeys.
You know, the very beginning of the book, if you remember, so there's a story and there's a couple sailing in space, and their name is Jin and Phyllis. So Jin and Phyllis are going through space, and they see a bottle, like a message in a bottle, if you remember. And so then
yeah.
So then they pull up and then they grab the bottle, and this story is what they're reading. So they're reading about, Ulysses and taking this journey, and so you're actually seeing it from Jin and Phyllis's perspective as they're reading. And so they get down there and they immediately kind of recognize that, these apes, they're all they get down there and then they initially meet like this beautiful woman and have like this kind of uncomfortable description of her in the book. And then like they have this little chimpanzee that's made the journey with them named Hector. And this girl, so they're like playing in a waterfall. They're like, wow, this beautiful woman, blah, 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 blah. They're playing in the waterfall. And then she jumps on Hector and strangles Hector, which was so shocking, when I was listening to the book. And I was like, she doing Hector super dirty there. And then you kind of come to learn that, okay, and that this is a Planet of the Apes and everything. And I think that first you see the gorillas all dressed up in hunting gear. And then things just kind of start and go downhill, really, for them from there.
Yeah. But not only are all the different types of monkeys, sapient, wearing clothes, walking around, talking. The humans, including this beautiful woman who later receives the name of Nova, they act like animals. They don't really communicate outside of certain grunts. They don't have any organized language, written or otherwise. They use no technology, no tools or anything of any sort, and they are essentially just animals. And it's really jarring for the main character Ulysses, because it feels very much like a roles had been reversed, right? Of on his home planet of Earth, the humans are the dominant species and monkeys are essentially animals, and now that role has been reversed. And I thought, there are a lot of things about the book that I thought were really interesting. But Jeff, what was some of your takeaways? What were some of the things that you thought were?
Well, I think that the fun thing. So, I love the most recent versions of the movies with Caesar, the Andy Serkis ones, I think starting in 2011. I love those books. And I think that what was so interesting when I listened to this, so I picked it up after I had watched those movies. So I only watched those movies maybe like a year ago or so. And then I got this book. It's on Audible Plus catalog. And when I started listening to it, I thought that maybe this would be a little bit like that. Although now that I think about it, at the very end, I'll get back to that thought. I just had a thought. Um, but I think what was so interesting and kind of fun about this book is that it was so different than the movies and so different than any of the stories that I had been told. But there are a couple things that, um, like one of the big differences was the roles of the different apes. So in this one, the gorillas are like the much more militant. The orangutans are like the spiritual leaders, the government leaders. And you have the chimpanzees that are kind of like the lab experiment, like the lab people.
Scientists.
Yeah, the scientists, yeah. And so you have these different groups within the society. And I just thought that it was kind of interesting because I felt like in the movies, they were all they didn't like necessarily have those really firm roles. But in this one, it was very much that way. And I think that what was so interesting to me about this is that this planet, right? So this planet is completely different than Earth. But at one point, so all of them get captured, and I'm building up to the part that was most interesting to me about the book. Besides the end, which blew me away. I just remembered listening and getting to the end. This book is like 5 hours long, not double speed. And when I got to the end, I was seriously blown away. But the thing that I liked the most was, these humans get captured and then they get put in to essentially become lab experiments. Unsurprisingly, Ulysses gets super into, he's like drawing geometric shapes. He gets a lot of attention to him. Then he kind of gets promoted to like wear clothes, to essentially be a servant, to be a little closely studied. But what's so interesting, and I need to just look at his name, Antelli, the professor who initially did all of this, right? As he kind of breaks free, Antelli actually regresses, and he becomes like an ape. He becomes like the other humans there. And what was so interesting to me about that is that as Ulysses goes and he develops relationships with other apes, eventually he learns kind of the history of, sorry, I just keep going into this, but like he goes into the history of what actually happened. So he goes and he's going through this art. He meets an archaeologist and he's excavating this city. He's helping him excavate this city that used to be a human city. And he finds like this robot or whatever that tells him kind of the story of what happened. And so what happened is that these humans on this planet domesticated apes. The apes began to talk. The humans actually just stopped using their brains. And so like instead of like a disease like in the movie, they like just stopped using their brains, and so they regressed. What I thought was interesting was that Anatelli regresses, right? He stops using his brain. This brilliant professor who created all this stuff, he becomes like the apes. But then what you see is kind of this promotion of Ulysses, almost to being a servant, just like the humans used to do with the apes. And so that storyline doesn't necessarily play out to where the roles reverse on that planet. But I just thought that it was so interesting how it's just all a big cycle, like this is just showing this inevitable cycle that humans and apes are in, and it just keeps going. And anyway, I just thought that it was so interesting how Anatelli, they eventually even like move him to the zoo. Do they move him to the zoo?
They move him from the zoo to a laboratory to try to rehabilitate him, but they're unable to.
Yeah. I mean, that's wild. And that to me was like one of those times where I was like, wow, that's so amazing. Like, I don't necessarily think that, we don't use our brains and we become, we regress to like ape status. But I do think that we do have a challenge as a species that as we keep progressing to make sure that all of us keep using our brains, not just a few of us. But yeah, anyway, you asked me what I liked, and there was a lot that I liked, but that was one of my favorite parts is seeing that happen, kind of that process.
Absolutely. And I think even taking that a step further, on the other end, you see Nova's progression going from animal to, by the very end of the book, where she's communicating and functioning, pretty much at the level of Ulysses, and just see how when one was engaged, she started to rise. And as Antilli started to become more analytic, he started to fall. And they were able to, I guess, in a sense, switch places. I did think that that was a really prominent theme. You know, as you were saying, Jeff, you know, when they found that, I think it was a doll that was a human, and realized that, they go into the apes' history, and the apes are kind of confused because their civilization just kind of started like 10,000 years ago. It didn't really have any build up. You know, when we look in our history, we look at prehistoric times and everything, and, you know, the buildup of multiple civilizations to get to where we are now. And they kind of observe that, and why they're doing this archaeological dig is they're kind of confused because their civilization just kind of started. And they were roughly at the same technological level that they were, you know, this was 10,000 years later from the start of their history. They were essentially the exact same. And they were stagnating, but they were just starting to progress. And that essentially they had found that, you know, find that this human civilization had fallen, and the apes had essentially subsumed that civilization, taking it over. And as they started to engage themselves, their civilization slowly started to move forward. And, you know, it's not to such a dramatic sense, but I've met people in my life where I've seen them stagnate. I've seen them stop. And there is, you have seen where people start to atrophy, you know, whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally. But in other times when people get that kick in the pants and start, you know, making changes in their lives, how just there's explosive growth and they really start to expand. I felt like that whole theme was really, really played out in something that was really interesting.
Yeah, and you know, to that, I think, you know, when you look at around the world and the competition that different civilizations and different countries are having right now to be, you know, the top dog. I mean, sometimes you do have the competitive advantage of being at the bottom. And, you know, you look at certain countries around the world that are going to do great things in the next 10 years. And in so many ways, they're going to compete with America and China and all of the premier economies of the world. They're going to compete with that because they're going to have that fire, you know. It was interesting. I can't remember all of the reasons why the humans fell, but I do remember, and I wanted to highlight the point that you made, that they just took over the civilization. Like, they just took over their homes. It's not like they created something separate. As they did better, the humans did worse, and then they just like kicked them out, and then they just put them all in a camp, and then eventually they just like kind of destroyed them all, and then they all went to the bushes, you know, and because it's like a big forest planet. By the way, something that we forgot to mention was that the humans actually destroyed their little spaceship. So like when they had first met those humans, you know, a bunch of humans and things, and then the gorillas came and hunted them and whatever. The humans had destroyed their ship, so they couldn't leave. So they're just kind of stuck there. FYI. But then eventually what happens is that, you know, Ulysses has such a good relationship with a few of these, you know, it's a couple, right? Zira
Cornelius
and
Zira.
Yeah. And so essentially they kind of work out a way for him to ride up on a satellite with his family, with him, Nova, and Sirius, their new little son, and to go back home. And then I feel like this is kind of where, to me, the book was so good, is kind of the end.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
You got the fire. Go ahead.
All right. So it takes them about a year and a half, I think, to get home. So they get back in their ship. It takes them about a year and a half. They just all keep, you know, progressing. Nova keeps progressing. And so he's from France, and, you know, he comes in and he sees the airport and he sees the Eiffel Tower. Nothing's changed. It's been 700 years. And then he goes and he lands. And like the first thing that he notices is that people are driving up in cars. And he's kind of like, oh, I thought we would have like gotten better than cars. So that's interesting. And then he notices when the person gets out of the car, it's like some high-ranking military official. And then suddenly Nova grabs Sirius and like runs back on the ship because they realize that it's a gorilla. And so they're met at the airport by a gorilla. And when I read that, I was like, oh man, that's crazy, that's wild. Oh, Planet of the Apes on their home world, and then here's this cycle, that just keeps going between apes and humans. We came from apes and now we're here and blah 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 blah. It's just this crazy cycle. Anyway, he gets back on the ship, Ulysses, with Nova and Sirius, and they blast off again. And then that's where he is writing this account. So he kind of finishes this account, and then what happens is that he puts it in the bottle and then he throws that into space, I guess. And then we just kind of are left with that. But then it goes back to Jin and Phyllis, and they finish the story, and they're like looking at each other and they're like, "Wow, that's crazy! Such a crazy story, wild story." And then they look at each other, but it's just such a fantasy story. I mean, could humans have ever really been that intelligent? And then it says that Phyllis looks up with her chimpanzee muzzle, and you're like, oh, this whole time Jin and Phyllis were freaking chimpanzees, and they pick up this story, and they are reading this story, and then they don't believe it because it's like, oh, humans could never have been that intelligent, and they like throw it away, and then you realize they were, chimpanzees the whole time. I thought that was just such a crazy fun, thing, and I certainly want to know what happens to Jin and Phyllis. Although I think that he mentioned somewhere in the book that they could have gone hundreds of years or something in that ship, so maybe they just stayed in the ship until they passed away. But anyway, super super fun book. I'm just kind of surprised that nobody has actually just made the story of the book the movie. I mean, there's some things that are similar, like in the very, very first one, they like get back to Earth. And Kevin, you and I were talking about this the other day. And there's like the Statue of Liberty, like hanging out of the beach or something when they get back. It's like, no, our planet, so like it goes to that. I just like the whole narrative of, maybe in a movie it'd be hard because you'd know that Jin and Phyllis were already chimpanzees by getting the thing. But it's just kind of like, it's such a fun thing to have them like get this thing, you read this story, and then realize. Anyway, I thought that it was just such a fun and well written book. It was so amazing. There's so many themes, and the crazy thing is like he doesn't really ever double click on any of the themes. Like he doesn't he doesn't have to come out and say, and this is a human cycle. Like he doesn't make direct parallels to our day. He's not trying to get a lesson across. He's just telling a story. And in that story, right, there's so many lessons. And I love how it's just not super obvious what he's getting at. So me as a reader, then I get to spend all my time and imagination interpreting what all this means. So I just thought it was really, really fun.
Yeah, and actually one of those themes that I thought was really, really interesting. They talked about essentially the main character, Ulysses, spends a lot of time, criticizing and evaluating the way that the apes are treating the humans. I'm talking about using them on medical experiments and, essentially just treating them like animals, and just drawing the parallels of how are we treating animals? How are we treating things that can't talk? At the end of the day, one of the, Jeff mentioned where you mentioned where you went from a total slave in captivity to, like an assistant in the lab. The turning point there was he was able to prove that he is a rational, sapient creature, and as he put it, has a noble air of a thinking being. And that was the difference. And just kind of the commentary of, is that the marker of treating something with respect? Is its ability to complain verbally the mark where we need to treat something with respect?
That's such a good point. Yeah, is the marker its ability to complain? Like when it can actually voice its own issues? I definitely never want to, personally, I don't want to ever elevate beasts above humans. Like if there's a clear choice between, an animal and a human, I think that we need to be in the interest of our own species, you know. And it's so weird because then you have like this speciation, but I think especially after reading this, like definitely feel a lot of loyal to our species, you know. Like I think if I'm in this, I'm not wanting to totally assimilate to another species, you know, that you can't ever really be a part of. In fact, one of them, it's like giving Ulysses a hug at the end, and she's like, "Oh, please just stop. You're just not that attractive," you know. Like they can't even, you know. And it's like it's because you're just totally different things. So like, but how do we not let our species be so dominant? Because on this planet, like I really struggle thinking that something is going to like. I think that it's just much more likely that we'll just defeat ourselves instead of having another species rise up against us. It's so unlikely. But you know, so like the retribution of animals, I think is like kind of hard to get my mind across. But at the same time, you just never know. You never know. And I think that like that karma aspect of, you know, how we treat things comes back, even if it's just with our own species defeating ourselves. I think that, you know, how we treat one thing is like how we treat another. And I guess we don't treat humans all that well sometimes. So we treat animals way worse.
Right. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, I think, you know, needless cruelty to anything is needless. I mean, really, cruelty, you know, some things happen and not, you know, as creatures, we want competing resources. That's just how the world works. There are predators, there are scavengers, you know, we want competing things. Every species wants something that another species has. But that doesn't mean we need to be cruel about it. That doesn't mean we need to abuse, you know, those who can't compete. I thought these themes were very advanced, especially for a book in 1963, which I think it's funny when a book about the 1960s and 1950s write books about the future, because they're either really like out there and are way ahead of where we are right now, or they're exactly the same as the 1960s except with space travel. And that's kind of what this one was. Like at one point the dude used chalk and the thing he wrote was on paper that, you know,
Right.
the two apes found at the beginning of the book. Like, you know, it's just one of those things where it's like, you know, he didn't really try very hard to think of what the future might be like. He just added space travel. And then of course, you know, as Jeff already alluded to, you do have you know, the casual sexism throughout the book, but still, you know, it is a dated book in some regards, but those other themes, you know, that we were talking about the stagnation of humans and trying to continue to progress. I mean, if you haven't seen that, just watch the movie Wall-E. And then the treatment of animals and all these other themes, like there are some very advanced themes that are still very relevant today.
Yeah, you know, it's just for such a short book and a free book, you get such a huge payout. So, you know, it's just for free on Audible Plus, at least as of this recording. And the reader was really good.
Yeah.
I thought, you know, it's an English voice, did super well. I just think that, you know, it really costs you nothing and you will only get things from it. Granted, we spoiled the entire book here because I think it's also so short, but I do think it's really fun. It's well written. You won't regret listening to it. You know, I just recently saw the new Planet of the Apes movie, which is much closer to this one, to this book, even though it's still happening on Earth. That brings me back to my point. So so there is kind of almost this opportunity for them to meld the two. They won't, but because it really wouldn't make sense. But you know, he leaves for 700 years essentially because of time dilation as they go, and so you could just think that during that time is when the Rise of the Planet of the Apes trilogy and then this trilogy happens. So like this epic is playing, you know, back and forth while he's gone, and then he comes back to to see apes, because in the movies where they're at right now, not like we made this to talk about the movies, but in the movies right now, like the apes, while they may be the dominant species and humans have regressed, humans have only regressed because of this incredible, bacteria type thing that's, made them that way. But apes haven't, for as much as humans have regressed, the apes haven't moved forward to be the level of humans. They don't really understand technology. They don't know how to operate it. They don't know how to create it. They recognize that humans had it and they want to harness it, but they can't like make it themselves. So like they didn't like take the whole place of humans. And so they're not quite there. And so it'll be kind of interesting to see how all that plays out. But yeah, super great. I think that you'll absolutely love the book. And I'm sure there's so many things we missed. So please message us with all the different things we missed so that we can keep learning. And yeah, I'm excited for the next one we do.
Yeah. Read the book. Oh, and one last thing that totally blew me away about the book. The sign off. Audible hopes you've enjoyed this
program.
Was different. Blew my mind.
Yeah.
Blew my mind.
Yeah. It's just the guy, the audiobook reader. And I think it's because it's an audio, like an audible production, But yeah, when he read it, it kind of throws you off. You're just like, where's the Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program? Where's that guy? Also, who is that guy?
No idea who that guy is.
How did he get that gig? Because he's like the Katzenberg. Is that the guy that's always in every single Pixar movie?
I think.
Is that who it is?
That name sounds familiar. It's the dude who's the pig in Toy Story.
Yeah, probably not Katzenberg. But anyways, yeah, like that guy, he's like, you get like the credit for being in every single book, even though you don't actually do anything. But anyways, thanks everybody for tuning in, and excited to catch you next time.